It's time for episode 117 of The Crisis Show, and tonight marks our first episode with the For Immediate Release Podcast Network. We'll be talking tonight about media training for businesses and organizations to prepare for crisis management situations. Good evening from the beautiful Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. My name is Rich Klein. I'm president of Rich Klein Crisis Management and founder and host of The Crisis Show, which launched in June 2012 and has been seen at least once in more than 120 countries. Before we get started, I just want to first of all say thank you so much to my friend and colleague, Shel Holtz, for inviting The Crisis Show into the For Immediate Release family. He's been a guest on The Crisis Show and runs a great business and venture with the FIR network, which talks about PR, corporate communications, social media, tech, and much more. Starting tonight, we'll be broadcasting right here on YouTube and Google Hangouts on air, although we're having some technical issues we're trying to resolve. But we'll be here on video, and also the podcast, the audio feed, will appear at firepodcastnetwork.com. We're putting that in our show notes as well. You can find this show and archives of The Crisis Show on YouTube as well as on Facebook at facebook.com/The Crisis Show. So tonight, I want to introduce my guests by audio. We weren't able to get them in by video just yet. We've been trying to work on that. Hopefully, we'll get that resolved soon, or at least get some good audio for you. First of all, my guests are really, I'm very lucky to have them. They've been on the show many times. First of all, he's the principal at the West Third Group out of Nevada, where there's just a little debate tonight. He's a veteran public affairs and marketing pro, and has advised many companies and government officials and a lot, I believe, industry groups as well. Greg Brooks. How are you, Greg?
Happy to be here, Rich, and congratulations on the move to the FIR network.
Thank you so much. Always good to have you. We miss your handsome face. And as well, just outside of St. Louis, Missouri, another longtime regular guest on The Crisis Show. He's the president of Media Masters, a veteran PR pro, and a former broadcast and print journalist, Tripp Frohlichstein. How are you, Tripp?
I'm very well, and thank you for inviting me. And once again, I also would like to congratulate you for getting on to the For Immediate Release Podcast Network.
Thank you. And both of you, I know, have worked with Shel as I have, and he's a pleasure to work with, and we're looking forward to a long partnership. So, gentlemen, let's get to the action, what we're going to talk about tonight. Obviously, there's this little debate going on, but we want to make this show about media training because, as you guys know from being in the business like I have, a lot of people give you guys the call and give me the call and say, hey, we need to train our CEO, our spokespeople. We're in the middle of a crisis, right? So we all know, and for those of you watching, we hope you're watching from businesses and organizations, we know that that's a problem because at that point, it's almost too late. We can do it, but it's very ineffective. So Greg or Tripp, either one of you, tell our audience what the advantages are of getting a head start, and when should a CEO or other middle manager people start to get media training, first of all?
Rich, I think,
and by the way, just identify yourself because you're on audio.
Absolutely. This is Greg from West Third Group, and I think any employee, once they're in a P&L position that has a reasonable chance of becoming exposed to the public, should have some basic media training. Now, that basic training may not look like what the CEO gets, but they should at least have an understanding of media dynamics and not feel frozen into silence if they're confronted by the media.
Very good.
I agree.
Yeah. Tripp, go ahead.
Yeah, from my point, I agree. Not only the people you're talking about, the P&L level, profit loss level, but sometimes subject matter experts who aren't ever going to be top in the company. But you got to remember, a lot of them don't know how to do it. They'll talk in their own language, for example. That's where a media trainer can come in and help them reach their audience more effectively. I also want to address that CEO point. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, I just agree. Go ahead. CEOs, this is really important to get it done early. Your question was, why is it bad at that time? Because they have everything how to answer the questions.
Excellent.
That's a great point. The other thing I would add is that if you are not trained and a crisis hits, then even the most confident CEO is apt to take the advice of their legal counsel regarding communications. And that advice is not always bad, but sometimes it can be. And having confidence in your ability to carry the message will allow you as a chief executive officer or other C-level role to determine what messaging is in the overall best interest of the company, not just the immediate crisis-based interest.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's a good point you raised, Greg, about the legal counsel, and I want to get into that because, as you guys know, and I know, there's often a conflict between the corporate communications people, the CMO, whatever title is handling the communications aspect, and usually the in-house counsel and or the outside counsel. How do you guys navigate that and convince an attorney, for example, that they should be more transparent and they should get media training themselves? Because very often, and this goes way back in corporate communications for decades, they'd say, talk to my attorney. So maybe, and I don't have any exact question for that, but I wonder if you guys could delve into that a little bit in some of your experiences.
Let me tell you a story that happened to me not too long ago with an attorney, and in the general sense, I would say, I think.
And this is Tripp, by the way, right? Tripp?
It is Tripp.
Okay, yeah.
I think a lot more attorneys I'm seeing get it. They're beginning to understand that no comment, for example, is an unacceptable answer because it means guilt, and it could very well cost them in terms of sales, reputation, stock price, all of those things. But here's what happens. Sometimes you just have to challenge them directly. I was in a situation, I was advising a hospital. A neurosurgeon had gone into a patient and gone into the wrong side of the patient's brain. All right, so they operated the wrong side of the brain. Now, fortunately, the patient was okay, but the story got out, and this was a big deal when it did get out. So first, the lawyer said, say nothing, and for 2 days they didn't. Well, the hospital found that people weren't coming to the hospital. They were afraid that they were getting some big problem there. So we crafted a statement. My first line that I recommended and that I told them that they should use, which they ultimately did, was, this should never have happened. So the attorney says, wait a second, you can't say that this should never have happened. You can't say that. And I said, so are you saying it should have happened? No, it should never have happened. I'm just not comfortable with it. And that's where the CEO, and to your point about making decisions, with the CEO is to make decisions, Greg, from the previous answer. The CEO, if you still haven't said, you're not being comfortable with it is not a good enough reason. We're going to go with it because it is a fact. It should never have happened. Nobody should ever operate the wrong side of a brain. So the statement went out, and it turned out to be very, very good. And even the attorney later said, okay, you were right, because lots of feedback, including from inside the hospital, dozens of emails went to the CEO saying, thank you for taking responsibility for what we did. We screwed up. We should take responsibility. So it actually worked out in a very positive, not only externally, but internally.
Yeah, and Greg, if you could talk about that as well. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, that's a tremendous story. And I guess all I would add is that to reinforce Tripp's point about more and more attorneys getting it, I've found myself in the last 6 to 8 months in several situations where a law firm has called and said, we have a client who is in a slow burn situation that will become public and will become a crisis. We want to get them trained and get a strategy in place beforehand. And oh, by the way, as long as you're going to come in and talk to that client, there are 3 or 4 more people who are not in crisis. But we believe it would be a good idea for you to talk to them as well. And, obviously as a consultant, you love those opportunities to just line them up and knock them out. But it's also indicative of, at the very least, the larger law firms, the regional, what I call the regional white shoe firms, are more broadly informed and better, in a better frame of mind to accept that they don't have expertise in all things, and all we are is the equivalent of another source of expertise for them, and we're not a threat.
Yeah, so guys,
we're not a threat. We want to work with them.
Right.
We're all looking for victory here, and victory is a minimized negative client outcome.
Yeah. So guys, I appreciate it. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Did you have more to say on that?
No, go ahead. Just as an aside, I would say if I woke up tomorrow and got all of my work through attorneys in that manner, I'd be a happy camper because it's much easier to not only sell the work, but to train people once you've sold the work. If you have their senior partner, head outside counsel, sitting across from you at the table saying, yeah, you need this.
Right. No, I totally agree. And in my work too, by the way, folks, for those watching, this is very helpful information from Tripp and Greg. And I just want to add as well, hopefully you have a crisis communications team, no matter what the size of your organization, whether it's, whatever, small business, large business, nonprofit, charitable organization. Very important to have a crisis communications team. And guys, what I always do, and I'm sure you do as well, is encourage or push for that the main attorney for that company organization to be part of that team so that they're in the loop and they can be media trained as well. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with it. I look whenever possible for the CEO or other relevant senior manager to lead the team. There is
absolutely
with some clients to say, okay, I'm going to put our counsel in charge of this, and I will even with counsel that I've worked with before and that I have a great professional relationship with, I'll push back on that and say, no, this is your company, and it needs a broad management perspective to guide you through the water, not simply a very narrow legal perspective.
Right. And I think the other thing, and Tripp, I want to pick your brain on this as well. Let's talk for our audience for their benefit in terms of, there are different kinds of crisis. I think it was Greg, you mentioned the slow burn, or one of you mentioned a slow burn, and, something that happens very quickly, a natural disaster, a really negative news story, a product recall like we're seeing with Samsung, which is a whole nother issue we'll get to later. But how far down, and maybe you can give some examples, because I know it definitely differentiates across the board depending on what kind of crisis you have. So you start with the CEO for those most serious crisis situations, right? So for like the airline CEO in a natural disaster, a mayor when there's a bad shooting or something like that. So I wonder how you guys strategize about that in your conversations at the C-suite. How far down do you go? Do you start with the CEO? Do you start with a communications person and try to work your way up and to encourage that multiple people get media trained? How do you do that? And I know, as I said, I know it varies, but I'd love to hear some of your anecdotes.
Tripp, you want to go first, or would you like me to? Go ahead, Greg. I like the question. For me, the differentiator in who gets trained and how thorough the training is are we crisis imminent, intra-crisis, or in calm seas? If we're in calm seas, I'm a big advocate of pushing the training down as far in the organization as possible. That probably doesn't mean line employees, but it certainly would mean department heads and above. If you are in a crisis, or if the crisis is imminent, there simply may not be time or focus to accomplish that. And, it's in a brush fire, you take care of your hot spots first and try and put up the fire break. And training the senior managers, who are ultimately the ones who are going to be called on the carpet by the board, by the media, and by the public, takes the highest priority.
Yeah, and I just want to, before you jump in, I do want to hear what you have to say, Tripp, but, and you use some corporate language, line workers. I guess my other question is, let me give you guys a hypothetical, and if Tripp, you could pick up on this, because this is one I struggle with as well. And that is, you have a multinational corporation, global corporation, whatever you want to call it. There's an incident in one office, but it's not the headquarters. So do you train just the CEO in the headquarters? Or, Samsung's a perfect example. You have a CEO in Korea, South Korea, but you also have a head of the U.S., a CEO or executive of the USA branch of the business. How do you guys look at that? And Tripp, if I may start with you on that.
You asked a long question there. Can you give me the
I apologize. It was part speech, part question. My apology. So when you're looking at a company as a client, and you're trying to pitch media training, and you're trying to get them prepared for the worst kind of crisis situations, and we all use hypotheticals in our marketing materials and in our training, right? So let's say you have a multinational company that has offices in Europe, let's say, or Asia. But the incident happened here in the States, or happened in like, say, Japan. But in other words, how do you identify, and how far do you go in thinking about, what do you tell your clients or prospects in terms of how important it is to media train like heads of regional offices that are not where the crisis is?
I see your point. I think it's really important, especially the train, when you talk about a multinational, for example, to train the U.S. people. One of the things, though, that we have to remember in all of this, and Greg referred to this as he talks about going down to the line level, and that is, who are the right people to train in any given crisis? Because, by the way, it isn't always the CEO. Now, if it's Samsung and some of those, yeah, it's going to be the CEO. But the problem is that that sometimes the CEO isn't the best person. For example, I was involved with another hospital situation recently where it was, even though it was a major deal about a patient who was going to be forced to leave, who was on a ventilator, right? We stayed away from the CEO, and we used a nurse to talk about what was going on. And by the way, we also, in this crisis, and this is getting more and more common, I'm switching away, I didn't want to forget this, guys. It's getting more and more common that you can post something on Facebook or just send them a piece of video and they're going to run it. It used to be in the old days, especially with unions, like here in St. Louis where I am, they would touch video we supplied. Now, we supplied about a 2-minute statement. Every word was, we didn't care which sentence they pulled. Any one of them would have been good. They pulled about 4 or 5 sentences. The woman who did it, the nurse, looked really good, explained it extremely well, and we actually helped change the story from bad hospital kicking personality. Isn't this a terrible system? So sometimes, and by the way, this woman I trained her probably 3 or 4 years ago, and all of a sudden she pops up. And when she went to do the statement, she was telling the people who were taping her, she was remembering her home base, her main message, and some of the stuff from years ago. So that brings back to the point that if you can get to them early, they're not going to remember everything you train, obviously, but a few key nuggets hopefully will stick. And so there's another case where early training in this case made a difference. But I do think it's important to remember who is the right person to speak, as opposed to, there's a big crisis, we have to train the CEO.
Right. And I agree with that. I think we all take the temperature of the crisis. If we're in the middle of it, who is the best person? And I guess the larger point I was trying to make earlier is if you could start at the top and work your way down from there, training people who have subject matter expertise, for example. So it's like a factory and there's a technical issue, or there was an explosion, and like we saw with the Deepwater Horizon, for example, things like that. So I think that's important to think about as well when we're coaching our clients. And I think you guys would agree, who's appropriate for the situation. Also, the intensity of the crisis, right? How important is it? And because very often, as you guys know, we'll say, no, it's not the CEO. It's this office, the person who runs this office. It's the subject matter expert. And also the other thing that we want to do is make sure that when we're doing the media training, we let our clients know that we tell them to reach out to other third parties who might be helpful in a crisis. For example, when there's an explosion or a fire, that you already, long before a crisis hits, you already have built-in relationships with the first responders, the hospital, and law enforcement. So it's not like you're all up there at a podium trying to figure out what to say. And that's why drilling is important too. But Greg, you want to jump in on that a little bit, that part of it, or anything else?
Well, I think you and Tripp have both made an excellent point. I should have emphasized as well that the CEO is not always the right spokesperson. I suppose I'm blinded by my current workload where the CEO is exactly the right person.
Well, that's a good problem to have, my friend.
About 4 different cases. I can't see past the end of my notes. I will say that a lot of what we're talking about covers either a crisis that's going on or training during calm seas. I think that the really interesting stuff, and hires an experienced hand, for lack of a better word, are these situations where, no, if everything plays out the way we hope it will, there will be no crisis. However, if any of the dominoes fall sideways, things suddenly blow up very fast. I don't know about you two, but I run into a lot of those situations, and it's not just a matter of training and training the right people. It's a matter of training for which contingency happens to occur.
Absolutely.
Are we showing up because the fire started over there or over here?
Yeah, and where is it? And where do we think this story is going to show up, right? And we have to make sure we're there too, right?
There's one other problem. This Tripp again. There's one other thing to remember about CEOs. I bet we've all run across them. There are some, not a lot, but there are some who just can't do it, and you just got to find a way to keep them. You just can't. Maybe you can issue a statement for them or something, but to allow them to be interviewed would be dangerous.
Yeah, we've seen that. That's a very good. So, what do you guys do in that situation? Where do you go after that? If you've determined either they've admitted it or you've discovered it in your conversations, what's your next step in that process? Who do you look for in the organization? If you can give me a title or two of places you go for that.
Well, it depends on the crisis. You look for somebody who's a good leader.
I'm sorry. One more time. I think that's
and relevant.
Yeah.
Relevant to the crisis at hand.
Right. Good answer. Absolutely. I also want to, so let me ask you guys, we've all seen many high profile crises over our, I think each of us has like 30 or 35 years experience. We're showing our age here. So the audience is getting about at least 90 years experience, right? Collectively. But when you're, what are some of the CEOs? Who are some of the CEOs that you think have done a good job in the most serious crisis situations, and those that haven't? And it can be from as early as the Tylenol crisis right up until the Wells Fargo now. I just want to get your thoughts about some of those who you think get it and have done well with it, and those who still need work.
One of the best was in 1988, and it was the CEO of Ashland Oil. And I know that's way back when, but the reason I mention that, what had happened there, is that they had spilled there'd been a big oil spill in Pittsburgh, and where those rivers all meet in Pittsburgh. So what happened was, for many people in Pittsburgh, couldn't drink water for up to a week because the oil followed the water's out of supply. So the CEO, whose name I'm not remembering right now offhand, but what he did, the first thing he did is got out there and said, we apologize for what's happening, and he immediately said, we're going to, and I know somebody who was on his PR team, so I'm going to say a little behind the story. He immediately said, we're going to pay for all costs related to the cleanup. By the way, that was where the lawyers got in. They said, please say related to the cleanup. So, and he said, sure. But that was the very first thing he did. And he did also what you recommended before. You talked about having first responders and stuff. They were good friends with the EPA, so they got lots of people to support Ashland Oil. Executives at the EPA and other places. They got the news media involved because they were paying checks right away. In fact, what they did was, this was really smart. They would go into a community and say, how much is cleanup going to cost you? And they'd say, $25,000. So guess what they did? Cut them a check for $50,000.
Wow.
So, because here's what the PR people said later. And by the way, full apology, and when it was all over, they ended up not even fighting in court, even though the lawyers said they could have, because the CEO said, we were responsible for this. We did this. And the fact that they doubled anything that was under $100,000, I think they doubled. The fact they did that, there were zero, other than the federal government suit for what actually happened to them, there were zero community lawsuits. So what the guy and the PR unit said, he said, this cost us millions. But if we had done it the legal way, this would have cost tens of millions.
Very interesting. Greg, you still with us?
That's a fantastic case study. Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I'm impressed with that case study. Since Tripp provided an exemplar of good behavior, I can't help but throw up both the head of BP in the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and frankly the soon-to-be former CEO of Wells Fargo.
Oh, he's gone already. I think he's
gone now.
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe the last check hasn't cleared yet. But he gave up his board seats, too. He gave up $624,000 annual salary just for sitting on boards today, too.
Hey guys, yeah, go ahead, Greg. I want you to talk about that. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that the former head of BP, he simply misunderstood the cultural outrage that the story generated, and his across the pond mannerisms and take on it were wholly inappropriate. I don't know who was advising him. I suspect it was one of the global PR practices. But if they did not advise him of the wide cultural gap between how the British were looking at this and how Americans were looking at this, then it was professional malpractice. And frankly, there's some historical perspective there too. When the Titanic went down, it was a shock when the Titanic went down. It was a shock that became a massive outrage when the leaders of the White Star Line basically sort of said, "Oh well," and didn't want to participate in the American investigation. Bringing it forward to the Wells Fargo situation, we all watched the congressional testimony. I don't know whether he was poorly trained or chose to ignore what training he got, but there's no way you can go into that situation with that backstory and not know you're going to get those questions. And yet, he did not appear to have well-messaged responses.
Yeah.
You know what that may be, Greg? I think I've noticed something. We talk about the 90 years combined experience. I'm going to generalize. There are exceptions. But my general situation that I've found is this. Those who are pretty good at interviews, at crises, those kind of things, want more training. Those who are bad at it think they're good and think they don't need it.
That's an excellent point, Tripp. Yeah.
And the Trump candidacy has probably eliminated 50% of our potential clients. There are people out there who say, "Oh, I get it. You just say whatever the hell you want. They'll be fine."
Yeah. By the gentlemen, I just want to interrupt you for a second, as I want to stay at Wells Fargo just for a moment. I had hoped to have you both on video, but since I don't, what I'm showing our viewers right now, and you'll see on the replay, I did a little research today. I was trying to look into, because I knew we were going to talk about this, looking into the corporate communications folks at Wells Fargo, and there's a ton of them. There's a lot of cooks there. But the guy who's in charge is a guy named Oscar Soros III, who has a very deep background, has been there many years. And just today, I was really shocked. I looked at his Twitter account, and what I'm showing our viewers right now is a tweet that he put out. Now, remember, we just talked about the former CEO, John Stumpf. He's gone, right? So he puts up a tweet earlier today, quote, "Another view, Wells Fargo's cross-selling controversy in defense of John Stumpf." And it was an article in the Star Tribune out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it was like a puff piece about, or an opinion piece about how great this guy was because somebody had known him 50 years. And I just didn't get that, as if this guy's gone and we all know the damage that was caused by this disaster, why would you still be defending the guy who's gone already and who is, got the probably the highest negatives of any CEO after the BP guy, So I don't know. Can you guys make sense of any of that?
It's almost like Berkshire Hathaway has shorts on the Wells Fargo shares at this point.
Yeah.
That's a horrible thing to post.
Thank you. Yeah. We
don't need 35 years of experience to know that. I can find a graduate student in PR who would know that.
And I was shocked to see that. Like, you got to move on at the very least, but this doesn't help you. It's like, first of all, yeah. So I'm curious, and I wonder if anybody else will notice it. But I happen to be doing the research today. I was like, whoa! And this guy worked for the Wall Street. I mean, this guy, Oscar Soros, from what I read on his LinkedIn bio, he's a top level pro in the business. So I was surprised. So I said to myself, something else is going on here. Maybe something I don't know. But.
But that brings up another point, though. You said a top-level pro of the business. I want to remind everybody out there that although you have to judge for yourself, there are a lot of bad media trainers and crisis trainers out there.
Absolutely.
Who will give you wrong, bad advice that will hurt you.
Absolutely. Great point. And so what I do, what I try to do when I go in, I mean, to pitch this kind of business, and I know you guys do it as well, of course. I want to just shift the discussion for a minute or two to some of the tactics that we use. I mean, and I'll tell you what I do, and I'd love to hear what you guys do when you're actually doing the media training, without giving away all our secrets, of course. But basically, and I know Tripp, you're a former TV news editor, right, and broadcast. I go in with a video camera, and I pepper whoever I'm interviewing, doing a mock interview, and I'm peppering with the toughest questions that they can imagine. They have no idea. I see you having a good time, Greg, huh?
I'm sorry.
I'm joking with you. I'm joking. I know you're in a spot there. You're not totally alone. But basically, I was just saying that I go in with a video camera and I put it on just like we're live now, and pepper them with the toughest questions. And I've done the research and all the issues that I think they may be facing. For example, I shouldn't say recently, a few years ago, I media trained the president and a lot of the administration people at a major college here in New York State, and came at them with all sorts of issues, bing, 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 one after the other. And then I wrote up an audit after that and told them how they did and where they have to improve. That's how I do it, gentlemen. So, and I'm curious because I don't know if I've ever really asked other people how they do it. It seems to have worked for me and my clients, but how do you guys approach that? I mean, that's part of what I do. Yeah.
I did a training just last week where about halfway through something very similar to what you just described, I was told, "You were a really devious reporter, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah. And now I'm your devious media trainer, and you're going to be a devious interviewee before we're done with this."
Right.
What I try and do is give them discrete, defined homework where they're weak. It's not enough to tell somebody where they're weak after they've gone.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
To me,
it's a starting point. It's a starting point. Yeah.
This is something that you can't do as much in a crisis, but if you're getting to train somebody before a crisis, to me, I just always build in a fair block of time after the formal training is over, and they know that they're going to get 5 or 6 calls from me playing the role of a reporter over the next 60 days. And if they can't take the call because they're busy, that's fine. We'll make it up. But I try and introduce that, guess what? You're on stage. You didn't know you were on stage, and now you are. Let's go through these, and then we'll do a post-battle report. And I found that to be helpful.
Excellent. And Tripp, how do you approach it?
Mine is a little bit differently. What I do before going in, well, 2 things. When I have a little bit of time in a crisis, and most of them.
And by the way, let me interrupt. I was talking about as Greg used the great words, in the calm seas. There's nothing going on. You're hired to help them get prepared for something. So yeah.
Yeah. In that case, what I do will be to come up with a list of after the training, a list of 50, 60, 70 questions, of which I'll ask several of them on camera. We'll critique it. We'll do it again a couple times. But then what I do is leave the list with the PR people and have them, unlike you, Greg, have the PR people will do the follow-up to make sure that they can answer all of the questions on the list. And when I say 60 or 70 questions, there are a lot of, it's all that potential stuff that you might see in a crisis. In fact, one of the things I distribute is a list of the 77 most commonly asked questions in a crisis.
Love it.
Because that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Which I'd be happy to share.
Please, no, that's great. And I think all 3 of us are, we seem to have a similar approach, and with little tweaks here and there. But I love all the ideas, and that's very helpful. I mean, I think it also depends on the client. I mean, certainly what I'm trying to do as well, if I'm training somebody for television interviews, body language is so important as well. I know that some people are just better at it than others. They're more comfortable in front of a camera. So I'm looking at that too. And I wonder if you guys could talk about that part of it as well. If they're sitting at a table or they're, however you do it, what kind of advice would you give to people who have never done media training in terms of body language? Just some basic tips.
That's a case by case too. It kind of depends on the person.
Yeah. All right. So how about what you shouldn't do? Anybody?
Pardon?
some of the no-nos? What are some of the things you shouldn't do when you're on camera?
Don't pick your nose.
Not the obvious things, you know.
Don't be afraid of makeup if you sweat a lot.
That's good. That's helpful. Okay, good. Other thoughts?
Don't everybody has some sort of visual tick, whether or not it's something the camera's going to pick up and or make them look less trustworthy. That'll drive whether you try and beat it out of them.
Right.
I don't. Really, you could file that under. Don't do anything that distracts attention away from you and your message.
Yeah, and I just
thinking about that thing you do with your eyebrow. Then guess what? You're being ineffective. Or if you're a woman that you've worn too much, and I don't mean that rude, to our women listeners, I'm not trying to be rude, but if people notice your outfit, say, "Wow, look at that great dress she's wearing, or that great outfit," you may have failed because they're focused on something other than you want them to focus on, which is the content that you say.
right.
You also, by the way, and you also want to keep your eye contact good. When wandering eyes can represent deceit or confusion to a viewer.
Yeah,
I think you have to be careful there too.
That's a great point. I was just going to say, to pick up on that, Tripp, is to look into the camera, because depending on the camera shots, the report, right. I was just going to say, whether it's a 2-shot or just they got one camera on you, you want to look directly into the camera or look at the reporter, but you don't want to be looking off to the side as well. I mean, that's a good point you guys make. So good.
Rich, I apologize for going off script here, but I need to leave the podcast. I have another commitment.
No, this was great. I knew you had to leave, so thank you so much, Greg. It's Greg Brooks, the West Third Group. And where are you tonight? You're in California or Vegas?
I'm in California. I'm going back to Vegas tonight to see if the town burns down after the debate. And then I'm actually in California the rest of the week.
Very good.
You gentlemen, always a pleasure.
Likewise.
And, take care.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for your time. Have a good night.
Hey, Greg. Hey, and in the meantime, Rich,
yes.
Can I give you a couple other things to avoid?
Absolutely. Please do.
Crisis?
Yep.
Really, 5 or 6 things. Number one, don't speculate, but get out all the facts you can. When I say don't speculate, let me rephrase it. Speculate carefully. I used to say don't speculate, but there are times that you can. Like if let's say somebody's killed, they say what was the cause, and it was electric. It was electrocuted. You might say that it was electrocuted. He was electrocuted. What caused it? That we don't know yet.
It's under investigation.
It could have been a bare wire.
Yeah.
Maybe, but we have to check that out. There are those kind of things where you can. Avoid words like no, not, never, nothing, or none, because those are going to be negative. They're going to reporters. This was studied by a guy. 3 out of 4 times will take a negative quote that has one of those in it. So instead of saying "I feel great," they would take the quote that says "I don't feel bad." So they'll take the more negative one. You have to avoid your jargon, especially your jargon. It can be scary. Avoid no comment or off the record. Avoid putting blame on anyone or anything. And here's where I'll get into Donald Trump. Trump is blaming everything on other people, as it's somebody else's fault. And whether you agree like Trump or not, you're seeing him do that. I mean, just stand back and watch that. And that's one of the things you want to avoid in the crisis, because while his followers and his base may like that, that turns off an awful lot of people who say that he won't take his own responsibility. Finally, don't assume the crisis will end quickly or early. It may, but don't assume that. So those are some quick things to avoid the crisis.
Oh, those are excellent. Thank you so much. And I'll add a few of mine and we'll wrap up. Certainly excellent points all around, Tripp, so I appreciate that. What I'd add to that is, in many crisis situations, let me give you a nice story, a nice case study that I watched just a few weeks ago. Let me start with that. There was a train crash in Hoboken that we all saw. It was national news. A derailment, and one person was killed. And what I kept hearing, and this and then again, depending on what kind of crisis you have, but a natural disaster, an accident, fire, explosion, this kind of goes for all of that. There's many holding statements that you can use in these situations. And this is for media training, but also if you don't have media training, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind, which is, we don't know the answer to that. In this case, it was the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board. They're going to get the answers. And when we have some information about the cause of the accident, we'll let you know. And that may take a few days, and we'll let you know. We'll either put out a statement or have a news conference and so forth. You have many. You look much better when you admit you don't know, but you're going to look into it, rather than saying, throwing out, as Tripp just pointed out, you don't want to go a place that you have to take back. So it's okay if you don't know, and journalists understand that as long as you're straight with them. What you don't want to have happen is, say you don't know, and then somebody else in your organization goes out and leaks something out or says something that's inappropriate. So it's really important, since we're talking about media training at the same time as crisis management, to make sure you know who is authorized to speak for your organization. And the bigger the organization gets, the more difficult that sometimes can be. But it's really important, especially when, as Greg just said earlier, when the sea is calm and you're not in the middle of a crisis, you know who's authorized to speak about a certain situation. And there may be multiple people, which is fine, but you want to make sure that only those authorized people speak or tweet or put stuff on social media. So Tripp, you want to pick on that point?
Yeah, that's really what you say is important, but I want to add one thing to that.
Yeah.
It includes the person. You have to train the person who answers the phone.
Absolutely.
For the company. And I'll tell you why. As a TV reporter in my years, that's how I got an awful lot of information during crises. I got somebody on the phone from the company who would talk about what was going on. First they would say they couldn't talk. I'd say, what's going on? What? We really can't say. Well, can I talk to somebody again? Well, they're all busy right now. Well, so there is a fire there, right? Well, yeah, but it's that kind of thing. So I was able to push it out of them, as opposed to training the person to say, and by the way, I can give that right now. I think the line is, I'm not the right person to talk. I'm not the right person to answer your questions. Let me find you the right person, period. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And also, in part of that media training, why the reason it's important too is very often you have a receptionist answer a phone for a whole business, and the executives may actually want to talk and get people up to speed, but if the receptionist or the person answering the phone is shutting people out, you can have a major problem, because within a half hour of that, you'll see a story in your local newspaper online that says they declined to comment. They didn't make anybody available. So that Tripp's point is really important. It's not just the top people. People who answer your phones they're your first line of communication to the outside world very often, and particularly when the media starts calling. So that's a really valid point. Anything else that you want to add in terms of tips on media training, on crisis management that fits into the conversation, Tripp?
Yes, one reminder to everybody, and I think it's the Donald Trump phenomenon that I'm basing this on, and that is to remember that in a crisis, you're still not going to please everybody.
That's
You can say all the right things and do everything perfectly, and you still might have 10, 20, 30, 40% of the audience that goes, they're full of bull, that's a corporate bull, and blah, blah, blah. And they're not going to believe you anyway. And I think you just have to have some realistic expectations. But what you're really going to end up looking at is, how is this going to affect sales? Samsung, for example, is got to be taking a huge hit because of the exploding Samsung Note 7s, in the sense that they tried to replace it. That didn't work either. So now people don't trust Samsung. I mean, there was even a exploding washing machine.
Wow.
Quite a picture to think about. But the whole idea is that, in this case, by the way, there's not much they can do about it. And you're going to have a lot of people. They can say all the right things, but there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, I just don't trust Samsung anymore. So I just want to remind everybody, a crisis communication is hopefully going to minimize the damage, but there will likely be, in a true major crisis, there will be some damage, and you just have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and I think also, I'm a big fan of getting the bad news out early, and that's something I talk about with my clients, whether I'm doing media training or not. And sometimes, as you know, Tripp, it's difficult to get an executive to acknowledge that, or an attorney who comes in and says, "Well, we don't want to admit liability because it's going to cost us." But there are ways of being transparent without incurring legal liability. That's where we come in to help them with that key messaging when we're doing the media training, right?
You are so right. Get the bad news out early. I have a little line that I use, which is, when in doubt, get it out, because it always smells worse as it ages.
Right. And in particular, because of the particularly because of social media, it's getting out anyway. And sometimes it comes from, and we're seeing that now with the crises that both the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign are facing, is that they can't control stuff's getting out in spite of them. And so we've seen it. We saw with and on the Clinton side, we're seeing the WikiLeaks thing, and things come out about the emails of the State Department and the foundation. On the Trump side, of course, we're still in the middle of this discussion about his misogynist behavior that came out through the tape, and then reporting by the New York Times, the Washington Post. And by the way, Tripp, as a former print journalist, I'm glad to see that big stories are still being broken by the print media, even if they're being broken online. It's good to see that that we still have that they still have enormous influence and credibility in this country, and that's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay. So I think we'll hold it there. We've got about an hour. To our audience, I just want to say thank you for watching. First of all, I want to thank my guest, Greg Brooks from the West Third Group, who has departed. Hopefully have a safe trip back to California or to Vegas, wherever he's going. And to Tripp Frohlichstein of Media Masters out of Missouri. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. This show is will be broadcast going forward every other Wednesday over YouTube. We do hope to get the handsome faces of Greg and Tripp on next time. We're glad we got them on audio at least. But now this show will actually be archived, and you'll get the audio podcast at www.firepodcastnetwork.com. There's a lot of great shows on that network, and we're so happy to be part of that family. So thank you, Shell Holtz, for that. Again, this is the Crisis Show. Thank you again, Tripp, and we're signing off. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Bye-bye now.